The morning I found out what my son-in-law had been doing to me, I was sitting in a hospital gown that kept sliding off my shoulder, and the doctor, a young woman who looked barely old enough to drive, was asking me to repeat the months of the year backward. I got to October and stopped. Not because I couldn't remember, because I realized, sitting there under those fluorescent lights with my paper gown crinkling every time I breathed, that I already knew something was wrong at home. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud yet. Let me back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I taught high school English for 31 years. I can still diagram a sentence faster than most people can read one. And for the better part of 8 months, someone who ate dinner at my table every single night was slowly, quietly, deliberately making me sick. I live in the house I've owned since 1987, 3 bedrooms, a front porch that faces east so I get the morning light, a garden I've been tending since my daughter was in diapers. My husband passed in 2019, heart attack fast, no warning, and after that, the house felt like it had too many rooms. My daughter, Becca, she goes by Becca, has since she was 12 and decided Rebecca was too formal. She worried about me being alone. She called every day the first year, then every other day. Then life, as it does, got complicated. She met him at a work conference in Atlanta. His name was Sterling. That should have told me something, frankly, a grown man in his 40s going by Sterling, and within 14 months they were married in a small ceremony in a botanical garden, and within 6 months of that, they had moved into my house. It wasn't my ideas, exactly. But Becca framed it carefully. She said Sterling's lease was ending. She said the commute from where they were renting was brutal. She said, and this is the part that worked on me, she said, Mom, I worry about you rattling around in that house by yourself. I am not a woman who rattles. But I said yes. The first few months were fine. Sterling was polite in the careful way of someone who has learned which words to use in front of which audience. He complimented my cooking and took out the trash without being asked and watched the news with me sometimes in the evenings. Becca seemed happy. That mattered more than anything else. I noticed the first thing in November. I'd been feeling off since early October, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, a low-grade nausea that I kept attributing to the change in seasons, to stress, to getting older. My joints ached. My hair, which I have always kept short and clean, started coming out in the shower in amounts that alarmed me. I thought thyroid. I thought menopause aftermath. I thought 67, Lucinda. What exactly did you expect? I went to my regular doctor, Dr. Okafor, in early November. He ran a standard panel. Everything came back within normal ranges, though on the low end for a few markers. He told me to rest more, reduce stress, consider whether I was eating enough protein. I went home and made myself a chicken breast and went to bed at 9 o'clock and thought, this is just age. But it kept getting worse. By January, I had lost 14 pounds without trying. My hands trembled in the mornings. I had headaches behind my eyes that arrived without warning and stayed for hours. I fell twice, once in the hallway, once on the porch steps, and the second time I couldn't get up right away, just sat there on the cold concrete for a moment with my palms stinging, thinking about how I had walked up those steps 10,000 times. Becca was worried. She said so constantly, in the hovering, anxious way she has that reminds me of her father. She brought me tea in the evenings, peppermint, which she said was good for nausea, and she fussed over whether I was taking my vitamins. She wanted me to see a specialist. Sterling agreed, very loudly, very warmly. He said, we just want to make sure you're okay, Lucinda. You're too important to us. I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I believed my daughter completely. It was Sterling I watched. I don't know exactly when the watching started. It wasn't one moment. It was an accumulation of small things that my brain filed away without my permission, the way your mind sometimes knows something before you do. He was the one who made my morning coffee. He'd started doing it back in September, said he was an early riser, said he liked having something to do while Becca got ready for work, said it was no trouble. I hadn't thought anything of it. People make coffee. It's not suspicious to make coffee. But I started noticing that he always carried my mug to me himself. Always, even when I was standing in the kitchen, he'd say, here, let me get that, and he'd hand it to me already poured, and he'd watch me take the first sip. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had just lost my husband 4 years ago, and I was old and sick and living with people who weren't me, and I was probably projecting some vague hostility onto a man who had done nothing except be too cheerful for 8 in the morning. Then I found the search history. This was February. Sterling had borrowed my laptop to print something. His own printer had been broken for weeks. Another small thing I'd noticed and filed away, and afterward I went to use it and the browser history hadn't been cleared. I wasn't snooping. I want to be very clear about that. I was looking for a recipe I'd visited the week before, and instead I found that someone had searched on my laptop for how long does thallium poisoning take to show symptoms, and can arsenic be detected in hair follicles after death. I closed the laptop. I sat down at my kitchen table. I looked out the window at my garden, at the dormant rose bushes I'd planted the year Becca was born, and I thought, I have two choices. I can tell myself there is an explanation, or I can act like someone who wants to be alive in the spring. I didn't say anything, not to Becca, not to anyone. Instead, I stopped drinking the coffee Sterling made me. I did it carefully over several days so it wouldn't look like a pattern. I'd carry the mug to my armchair, hold it, take one small sip if he was watching, and then quietly pour the rest down the bathroom sink when I went to take my morning medication. I started making my own tea in the electric kettle I kept in my bedroom. I'd had it for years, originally for late nights when I was grading papers, and I drank that instead. Within 2 weeks, the headaches were less frequent. Within a month, I could walk to the end of my street and back without feeling like I needed to sit down for an hour. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick in a different way. I called my friend Marvella. We've been friends since our daughters were in Girl Scouts together, 30 years at least. And I told her I needed to see a doctor, but I needed to go without Sterling or Becca knowing. She didn't ask a lot of questions, which is one of the things I love about Marvella. She said, "What time do you need to be picked up?" The specialist was a Dr. Fenwick, an internist recommended by Marvella's own doctor. I told him everything. The symptoms, the timeline, the search history, the change when I stopped drinking Sterling's coffee. He looked at me across his desk with an expression I couldn't quite read, not disbelief, exactly, more like careful attention, and he said, "I'd like to run a very specific panel if you're willing." The results came back 10 days later. Elevated levels of thallium. Not acute poisoning, not enough to kill me quickly, but chronic, sustained, low-level exposure that had been accumulating in my body for months. Dr. Fenwick said it was consistent with ingestion. He said I needed to contact the police. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time before I drove home. I want to tell you something about that drive because I think about it still. I wasn't crying, I wasn't shaking. I was thinking about Becca. Not about Sterling, not yet, he would come later, the rage would come later, but about my daughter, who I had raised, who I had read to every night until she was 10, who had sat beside her father's hospital bed holding his hand, who was married to a man who was trying to kill her mother, and she didn't know. I needed to be certain she didn't know. I bought a small camera from an electronics store I'd never been to before. I paid cash. The salesman showed me several options, and I chose one that looked like a smoke detector because I already had 3 real smoke detectors in my house and one more wouldn't raise questions. I installed it in the kitchen myself, above the cabinet where I keep the mugs, angled so it would capture the counter and the coffee maker. Then I waited. I also went back to accepting the coffee. I thanked Sterling for it. I told him I'd missed it. I carried the mug to my room, poured it down the sink, and drank my own tea. I did this every morning for 9 days. On the 10th morning, the camera recorded Sterling opening the cabinet under the kitchen sink, not for dish soap, not for anything that lives under a sink, removing a small glass bottle, and adding a precise, measured amount of something clear into my mug before pouring the coffee. He was humming. I have watched that footage more times than I can count, and he was humming something while he did it. I still don't know what song. I called Marvella. I called Dr. Fenwick. I called the non-emergency police line and asked to speak with someone about a potential poisoning, and I want to tell you that saying those words out loud, a potential poisoning, and I believe the perpetrator is my son-in-law, felt like stepping off a curb I hadn't known was there. Like the ground shifted an inch in a direction I hadn't planned for. 2 detectives came to my house the next morning, while Becca and Sterling were both at work. I showed them the footage. I gave them the bottle. I'd found it 3 days before, wrapped in a plastic bag inside the toe of a snow boot Sterling kept in the garage, which told me that wherever I had gotten, he had gotten further, and I gave them Dr. Fenwick's documentation and the printed copies of the search history I'd photographed with my phone the night I found it. One of the detectives, a woman with gray at her temples and the calm manner of someone who has seen a great deal and chosen not to be destroyed by a set, said to me, You did everything right. I didn't feel like I'd done everything right. I felt like a woman who had shared her home with a stranger for almost 2 years. They arrested Sterling at his office that afternoon. Becca called me from the parking lot of the police station, crying so hard I could barely understand her. I drove to pick her up. I sat with her in the car for 2 hours in the cold while she asked me questions I couldn't answer yet and cried for reasons she couldn't even name yet. At some point she said, "Did you know about any of this before?" And I said, "I suspected. I didn't know." And she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, "Because if I was wrong, I would have broken something I couldn't fix." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached over and took my hand. The investigation took 4 months. The bottle contained thallium sulfate, and when law enforcement searched Sterling's car, they found documentation that was, according to the prosecutor's office, consistent with a plan that had been in place since before he and Becca were married. He had a significant amount of debt that Becca didn't know about. He had at some point learned that my house was in my name alone, and that I had life insurance, and that I was the primary beneficiary in Becca's own estate. He had done the math that people like him do and arrived at an answer that did not include me. At his sentencing, he said nothing. He stood very straight and said nothing and looked at a point on the wall behind the judge's head. I was sitting 3 rows back. I wanted to see his face when the number was read. 18 years. I want to be careful here about how I say what I'm about to say, because I have spent 67 years trying to be a fair-minded person, and I don't want to abandon that now. I don't celebrate 18 years in the way you might celebrate something good. What I felt when the judge said it was not joy, it was something closer to relief, and then, almost immediately, grief. For the marriage my daughter had believed in, for the years of her life that were tied to someone who had never seen her as anything but a means to an end, for the mornings she made him coffee and thought they were building something together. But Becca is resilient. She gets that from her father, honestly. He was the most resilient person I have ever known, and she inherited that along with his stubbornness and his laugh. She moved back into my house after the trial, into her old room with the sloped ceiling and the window that sticks in the summer. She brought her plants and her coffee maker, and we learned to share a kitchen again, which is harder than it sounds when two women have each been living alone for a while. I'm telling you this for a reason. Not for the drama of it, though I understand why that's what catches the eye, why a title about poisoning and hidden cameras is the thing that makes you click. I understand the draw of the story, the villain, the justice at the end. I was there. I lived it. I'm telling you because I spent 8 months slowly getting sicker and thinking it was just me, thinking it was age, thinking I was overreacting. And I want you, especially if you are older, especially if you are living with someone and something feels wrong, to know that your body keeps records even when your mind wants to explain things away. Pay attention to the records. I want you to know that it is not disloyal to your family to protect yourself from someone in it. And I want you to know that the rose bushes outside my front porch bloomed this past April, big and heavy and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the house behind them. I sat on the steps, the same steps I'd fallen on, the same concrete, and I drank my own tea, made in my own kettle, and I watched them bloom. I plan to be there when they bloom again next year and the year after that and for as many years as they'll give me.